Kia ora, nau mai hoki mai ki Branching Out, the podcast where we explore Indigenous forests and Indigenous forestry in Aotearoa. In this episode, we're joined by Karen Bayne to talk about Indigenous forest products and the value chains that support them. Well, tēnā koe, Karen. Are you able to give a little bit of an introduction about yourself? Where you're from? What's your mahi? How long have you been doing your mahi? What are you passionate about? That kind of thing.
Sure. Well, thanks, Kitarangi. I guess for me, I am a Southern girl. I was born in the North Island, actually, but I have moved all over New Zealand. And now, of course, I'm in Aotearoa, and that's home. In terms of my mahi, I have been at Scion working here for nearly 30 years, actually, in a range of different things, but it's all related to the end use of forest materials and how they're processed, how they're used, and what people think about them. Officially, I'm a consumer behaviour specialist and a product development specialist. So I look at how people use things, what they want from products, and obviously the product development side of that is, well, how are they processed and how would you actually physically gain the value that is in the resource through to a consumer.
Sweet. So I guess the first topic is the types of products that you can derive from trees. So you look at value chains and understand supply and demand and that sort of thing. Our first question is, what are the primary types of products that can be derived from Indigenous New Zealand tree species?
Well, everything that you can get from an Indigenous species, you can pretty much get from any tree. But it's interesting that most of the products that we use are very industrial from the exotics. And really, we've only explored sort of the timber side with Indigenous in that way. So in the exotics, we've not just made timber, but we've made plywood, we've made particle board and MDF and all sorts of things. We haven't really gone that far with the Indigenous. We've made plywood, we've made veneers. Don't think we ever made composite products out of the Indigenous. But the Indigenous species, because of the range of them in New Zealand, the non-wood forest products are things that we should be looking at. And I always talk about non-wood forest products in terms of the Fs. And there's a number of Fs. So you've got food, you've got fibre, which I don't mean the wood necessarily, but the bark and the stringiness of it. You've got fodder, little sort of coppicing things that come through when you cut a tree and it regrows, or the leaves that can be used for animals to feed, nut scan as well. You've got fuel, bioenergy. You've got phytochemicals, which are two things. One, sort of the medicinal products. These are all the extracts that are present within the timbers. And part of that is you've got the sort of human health aspect. You've also got the industrial chemical route. So all your furniture oils, your things that can go into paints and stuff like that as well. You've then got flowers and foliage and seeds. All the things that you can do, floristry, you make honey, you can, pollens and the leaves themselves, crown of the tree. You can also extract, it is a chemical route, but you can make, fashion. You can actually wear parts of trees, and that can be highly industrialised, or it might not be. It might be more world of wearable art or something. And of course, you've got fungi coming out of the resource, and you've got fauna. So there are different things that you can do in a forest environment besides just the timber. And that's, I think, where the future of Indigenous forestry in New Zealand might be.
So you mentioned earlier medicinal products. Can you discuss the potential of medicinal products derived from some of our Indigenous trees?
Sure. So the kind of extracts that you can get out of them and lots of chemical compounds are present in all sorts of trees. It's often sort of antifungal, antimicrobial, antibacterial. There's various aspects to what you can get. The proof of those is when you take the chemical breakdown and you can see the range of things. Ngahere was used as a demulcent for coughs and colds and flus. So that's the mucilage that comes out of the bark of the tree, but also the leaves. So that was quite well known. And there's quite a lot of medicinal uses around that species particularly. What I like about Ngahere is that it's not necessarily the timber that's the interesting quality. So Ngahere traditionally was used for the bark. And so you've got the outer bark, which was used for fishing lines and cordage. Then you've got the inner bark, and the inner bark, it's why it's called lace bark. It's got a cool pattern. It's quite thin in layers, and it's got holes through it, and it looks like lace. It was actually used to make trims for bonnets and things like that. When you see a cut log that's been left for a bit, you can actually see those layers coming away as it dries. Ngahere it has that bark, but also within the bark or just under the bark layer. And that inner bark, that lace, is called repahina. It's sort of soaked with mucilage. It's kind of a gel-like substance. And that was used for when a baby was born. It has anti-inflammatory and antibacterial properties. It was placed on the tummy button, the pito. It was used for that purpose. It's also got polysaccharides in it, of course, but it's got one in particular called glycine betaine, and there was a study that stated glycine betaine is really useful as a drought stress inhibitor for plants. So could be the mucilage is actually helping with that. I don't know. But it's part of the Malvaceae family.
It's interesting you say that because I know that they've been looking at that nanocellulose gel in a similar way to sort of prevent drought stress.
Yeah, and I'd like to know if the mucilage actually can be turned into some kind of a hydrogel or something like that. There was, in packaging, you could make some kind of a thin material out of this that could be dissolvable.
Yeah.
So there's a packaging application that has been mooted as well. But yeah, that inner bark, it was used in that way for the little, the repahina inner bark was used to place over the baby's belly button. That mucilage, it's got very similar properties to slippery elm. And slippery elm is being used as a medicinal herb in America by Native Americans. The interesting thing there is that you might be able to get the mucilage also from leaves. Might not be as good or might not be the same. I don't know. We have to study these things. But then maybe you could replace the source with something from a New Zealand Indigenous species. As you said, it's fast growing, really fast growing tree, ngahere. So it might actually be something where you can cut those down because they don't take as long to reach maturity.
Yeah, I suppose that's the other side of the coin of making something economically sexy, I suppose, is that you need to really make sure that it's not going to be too economically sexy because then it might be over-harvested.
That's exactly right. And that's kind of where you want to make it so that it's able to not have to cut the plant down to harvest, or else, you can harvest at a young age so you can plant for harvest.
Cool. A question that I'm keen to find the answer to is, what are some of the innovative or lesser known products that can be obtained from native tree species?
Oh, this one's really, really interesting. One of them, nio, we know nio and toot, they're poisons, but Landcare Research was looking at nioene and tutoene as a poison for using in pest control in the forest, something other than 1080.
Yeah.
So, we've got pests in the forest now. How can we treat that by using Indigenous chemical means rather than spraying 1080 everywhere? And I think one of the ones that we do kind of know about, but again, we don't know very much about, is there's a species called pink pine. Pink pine, it smells beautiful, really beautiful. And it was used by wood turners in the 70s and 80s quite a lot in the West Coast for souvenirs, because it's kind of a bit like cedar and those lovely timbers that smell and could be used in a potpourri kind of way. The interesting thing is, because it smells, it's perfumed, and it actually has a characteristic chemical compound in there that is kind of a bit like ambergris that you get from whales. So it's used in perfume manufacture. I think it's called manul. And this particular pink pine that's an Indigenous species, it's got quite high concentration of manul, and manul is what is used in perfume. So you can look at that and think, wow, we've got a really lovely fragrant tree. Maybe that could be used commercially for something perhaps more industrial scale than just putting it as potpourri in a bowl in a souvenir shop.
So you mentioned looking at the forest or looking at trees in a different way when you think about the different types of products you can get. My question is, are there different ways that we can, I suppose, harvest plant tissues differently? How does the harvesting method impact the type and quality of products derived from these trees?
That's really interesting, because the way that we have processed exotic species has been to extract the timber primarily. And so we have sawmills and we have peeling plants and we even have debarkers and things to ensure that we can remove the aspects that we don't want and get to the timber that we do want. That's got to change. If the bark is what you actually want, then you have to take a lot of care in how you are extracting logs. Maybe you're not extracting logs, maybe you're extracting branches to get the bark. Maybe you're extracting other aspects. Maybe you have to, cut and peel the bark off a standing tree and then take the standing tree because it's the bark that's precious and the mucilage underneath is precious and you don't want to do anything to that. Yeah, so your whole way of thinking changes. One of the other aspects that we are thinking about is whole tree harvesting because obviously with Indigenous species, it's a taonga and it's precious and we're getting into the age of circularity becoming very important. You don't want to waste any of that. At the moment, when we cut down a radiata pine tree, we have multiple pathways for the tree to go down. So some of the tree will go into structural logs, some will go into pulp logs. The bark will go into either landscaping, sometimes energy, and the crown is often left behind to produce nutrients for the next crop. So we're thinking about how we're cutting that tree up for those markets, and we're also sending them to different processing pathways. So a pulp log will be sent to be made into pulp and ultimately paper and packaging. A structural log will go to a mill. It will be cut into pieces of timber to build houses with, and the bark will go to a landscaping place. Now, you also get sawdust and you get the waste products, and you need to utilise those waste products from the sawmill, which we do in energy plants, or they go into particle board manufacture or MDF or something, So we're thinking about how to use the whole of radiata because it's not economic to cut down a radiata tree and just take the structural and leave the rest behind on the floor of the forest, nor is it economic to just take the pulp logs and leave the rest.
Yeah.
So if we're going to harvest native timbers, we have to think about it in the same manner. You can't just harvest and say, I just want the bark, or I just want the wood, or I just want this part of the tree. Because what are you going to do with the rest? It's a lot of waste. We could turn it all into bioenergy. Absolutely. A lot of the biorefining and valorization aspects come in because you really need to find uses and find ways to make that waste an input into some other process. A lot of this question of why can't we make money off Indigenous species as they are? Well, when you're looking at large logs, that's a lot of its timber and you've got a small amount of stuff that's not timber that you can get rid of. But if you're just wanting one or two aspects of the tree, what do you do with the rest?
Yeah.
And you have to have pathways for that. And especially when you've spent thousands of dollars on establishing these species to start with, it's really important that you get an economic return off them. So we have to think in a different way about how we process, definitely.
Yeah, and I think there's a few things that are sort of coming to my mind as you're speaking. We've been looking into the Māori circular bioeconomy and what that looks like. And I had a friend come up to me the other day and she said to me, but haven't you guys been doing that for hundreds of years? And I said, yeah, we kind of look at our plants and our animals very holistically and we harvest them holistically. We try to make use of every part of the animal or the plant. And I think that's pretty consistent across most Indigenous cultures. And somebody said to me, oh, so the circular bioeconomy is something that Indigenous peoples as a whole have been doing for a really long time. And I thought, well, yeah. And, when we're talking about natives and sort of using all of them, if we're going to harvest, there's also the thought around Y262. And, if we're thinking about harvesting our Indigenous species and there is that idea of Y262, then in more ways than one, harvesting the whole plant is good financially, but culturally too. It sort of reflects Māori culture and our values to do it that way.
Yeah, it's also, you have to think about where a lot of the Indigenous species are at the moment and also where they will be planted in future. And it's often marginal lands and it's remote areas and it's Māori-owned trust land. They're often not near processing mills, processing ports, and it's not really set up for that large-scale industrial harvest either, because unless you're planting a mass of hectares of one species, you can't just load all of that material on and take it somewhere.
Yeah, a real lack of infrastructure.
So lack of infrastructure. And like I say, if you've got a mixed native species planting area, then you won't be harvesting all of that all at once, probably. You'll just be taking some species to harvest. And so what you do with that you probably are looking for on-site, on-land processing. It will be small scale. We use the term micro-enterprise. It's a smaller scale, batch processing, circular, and that way it's more that you are distributing the parts of the tree around the different processing sites to get the best use out of it. You kind of have a factory line, but it's to ensure you get everything out of the one plant. And that might require different types of equipment. At the moment, we have mobile sawmills and wood misers, things like that, to deal with single stems. But how do you deal with single bark, or we only have 1 or 2 crowns? Do you need a big threshing machine? Do you need those industrial scale rope making facilities that they used to have for your harakeke? Or do you want something smaller scale? I actually think automation and robotics comes in there really strongly too. I think for Indigenous species harvesting, it could be the way that we need to go too, because you don't need large industrialized machinery and equipment, but you might need something that's smaller, smarter, and more mobile.
I'll just jump into our next question.
Sure.
And I think I know what you're going to answer. Are there any specific Indigenous trees known for producing high value or unique products?
We've traditionally thought of forestry and a lot of that around the timber. And when Europeans came to New Zealand and saw the species, they talked about the big 5, which was matai and rimu, totara, kauri.
Kahikatea?
Kahikatea, thank you. Yeah, but those were sort of the big 5, and everything else, unfortunately, was overlooked. But it had really special properties, but I guess you can't look at all the species. But you compare that to boreal forests, they do look at lots of other species and manage it, and when it's mixed, they do. But those were the 5 species that were looked at. Then you've got the secondary species, and sometimes the secondary species, the timber might not be so interesting, but for species like kowhai, for species like koheria, even ones like mangio, which is an amazing timber. Mangio is really, really good for musical instruments. It's a tone wood. Because you don't need a lot of wood for musical instruments, it kind of gets overlooked. It's not really a building species, but it's an amazing timber. We don't know a lot about mangio, but we should know more. Rata is one of the densest trees you can find in the world. We looked at pake flooring, manufacturing pake flooring from Rata in the 60s and 70s. There was a study done at FRI.
Oh, yeah.
But because we couldn't get the drying and the consistency wasn't there and the drying wasn't there, it was dismissed because at that stage we didn't have the technologies that could assist with the drying schedules, nor any of the wood modification technologies. But you think today maybe we should be relooking at things like that, because now we have got those modification technologies that could be applied to Indigenous species, and not just enhancing wood that requires it like radiata, but enhancing a really good wood to be a superb superior wood. We have looked into is faux, and faux has very unique properties. If you looked at it from a timber perspective, you wouldn't touch it. It's very lightweight, low density, and it doesn't seem to have any sort of structure or anything that would make you stop and think that you want to use it for any particular purpose, but it floats. It's very good as a flotation. It is a Malvaceae as well, so it has that mucilage component. And one of the things that they use with faux leaves, the faux leaves are really, really soft. And they use faux leaves to wipe babies' bums and wrap them up. And you think, well, if you didn't have really soft material and textile and you don't have toilet paper and things, then what do you use? Well, obviously, it's a very good species. And I was surprised just how soft and supple the leaves were when I first was introduced to the species. It's really fit for purpose. And I think that's the thing, that there's a lot of fit for purpose.
Yeah.
And we kind of forget that, and we try to make species do everything. And so you look at a species like mangio and you go, oh, it's a big tree, it must have great wood for soaring up and making boats or making houses out of. And it's like, well, actually, this wood's really, really good for musical instruments, but it might not be so good for some other things. I mean, it probably is good for cabinetry, but it's not necessarily a structural timber in the way that totara and rimu and that was used for. It's just looking at it with a different lens, and I think that's what I'm trying to do, is to understand not just these properties, but actually to have it in a useful form. We're actually trying to build the knowledge that we do have so that it is more of a repository or is more of a searchable engine so that you can actually understand what you've got.
Okay, and so I guess based on your experience, what role does traditional knowledge play in identifying and utilising products from native trees?
Oh, a lot. A lot of the indicators for what we should be using comes from both Māori use and also early settler use, because it was the only wood that was available and therefore it was well utilised. And the plant species, they were the only things that were really there as well. We do rely heavily on those accounts of Colenso and Best and some of the collections and compilations from the utilisation division of what this species was traditionally used for. And that gives you an indication of the wood properties that would be present and the chemical structure that might be there, the phytochemicals that might be present as well.
Yep. Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
And so how are byproducts and waste managed in the process of deriving products from Indigenous species?
That's really interesting. I think we don't really utilise byproducts as well as we could. I think it is utilised in, I guess, crafty homesteading things. You know, you can go into Rongoa classes and learn these things, but I don't think we do. Not really.
No. And I suppose that's your
no.
job, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that's part of it is knowing how. I think part of it is finding a use for the byproducts and knowing how to process to be able to take those byproducts and do something useful with them. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, we just don't know enough about the tree product pathways. We really don't. So we don't know what will be the wastes from that processing that needs to be made more circular either.
Yeah. And so can you provide examples of successful commercialisation of products from Indigenous tree species?
Yeah, there was one that was up until the 1980s, and it was from Poroporo, which was a contraceptive, used as a contraceptive, and a factory was actually producing this out of Taranaki, but it became too expensive to produce when sort of synthetic alternative contraceptives came through. So that commercialisation shut down. But I think times are changing. I mean, we're kind of going away from synthetic towards more natural products again. And so a lot of the things that we used to use came from the forest and were plant-based. Right. And then we went to petroleum and synthetic. So now there's a large drive towards more plant-based again and organic. So what was not economic in the 80s when they ceased that might actually be economic to produce now. So I think we can relook at some of those things where we have had commercial success.
It's interesting you mentioned that birth control thing because, you know, in recent years there's been more and more information coming out about how birth control pills are quite high-level carcinogens and even some other feminine products and whatnot. So, yeah, why wouldn't we just look into our own backyard or those more natural products and try and understand, are they carcinogens too? Or are we a little bit better off?
That's exactly right. Yeah. So I think there's a great scope for utilising more of our Indigenous products that have unique properties in some of these product lines that, you know, that could combat our need to import certain species, certain drugs, certain oils or paints or whatever, if we can get into actually manufacturing out of the properties we've got from our forests. We've got a raft of species, all with unique properties. It's just honing in on what each provides and how best to utilise and how best to process them. It will take some effort to do so. It's not going to happen overnight.
Well, I suppose that's the thing about forestry. Nothing happens overnight. Hey, Karen, thank you so much for being our guest speaker today. We're definitely looking forward to hearing more from you next time. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. Come back next time to hear more about Indigenous forests and Indigenous forestry in Aotearoa. Mauri ora.